It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. Thousands of Yemenis are rallying in the city of Taiz, calling for an end to this year-long war that has caused unbearable suffering to its population. A Saudi-led U.S.-backed coalition has been bombing Houthi rebels in Yemen since March of 2015, leaving civilians in the middle of a war with rival factions vying for power. The humanitarian crisis keeps escalating. Nearly 10,000 people have been killed, and over 320,000 children are starving. Saudi Arabia is facing a lot of criticism for its bombing in Yemen, but no one is doing anything about it except that they keep providing more arms, with US, UK, Germany, and their arms manufacturing corporations being the largest provider of those arms, not to mention other countries, supposedly more civilized countries like that of Canada and France. Joining us now to discuss this is Sheila Carapico. Sheila is a professor of political science and international studies at the University of Richmond, Virginia. Her latest publication is a collection of edited works titled Arabia Incognita, Dispatches from Yemen and the Gulf. Sheila, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Sheila, defense expert William Hartung says that U.S. transferred some $50 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia in the first six years of the Obama administration. This does not even begin to factor in the deals that were made under the Bush administration. So to what extent is the U.S. arms deals with Saudi Arabia directly fueling war in Yemen and their ability to project power across the region?
Well, those figures you just cited don't include the accelerated sales of weapons by the United States and other countries to Saudi Arabia since the beginning of their intervention into the civil war in Yemen. So the United States is a number of organizations, including human rights observers and humanitarian organizations, have implicated the United States in, at the very least, possible war crimes for providing weapons that are being used not only to bomb Houthi rebels, but sites that in some cases really have very tenuous connection to the Houthi rebellion or its ally, which is also forces still commanded by the deposed President Ali Abdullah Saleh. So the Saudis have been firing indiscriminately on civilian targets for 13 months now.
Sheila, the anti-war protesters, they're also resisting the Houthis as well as the Saudi-US-backed bombings that are going on. Describe more about what they're calling for on the ground.
Well, in the particular city that you mentioned, Taiz, has suffered tremendously, both at the hands of the Houthis, for whom we have very limited sympathy, and who have particularly behaved rather badly in the city of Taiz, where they were not particularly welcome, and there have been battles on the ground between Houthi rebels and other citizens of the city who don't necessarily back, I may add, the government that the Saudis prefer, but who have resisted the Houthis. So specifically in Taiz, it's been a particular humanitarian disaster caused in part by the Houthis themselves and then aggravated and accentuated by indiscriminate Saudi bombing using American weapons. So the situation in Taiz, there's a cartoonist whose works, his name is Samer El-Shamiri, whose work is also in Arabia Incognita, and he showed one cartoon which was a cage around Yemen and then an additional cage around Taiz. So the large cage around Yemen would be the Saudi coalition with its embargo and its bombing campaigns. But specifically in Taiz, there's also, again, considerable opposition to the way the Houthis have behaved. So those people along with people in other communities, including Aden and Sana'a. I mean, each community, especially the large cities, have slightly different political positions. Specifically in Taiz, they're calling for everybody to stop, also for badly needed humanitarian assistance.
Now, describe the humanitarian condition on the ground for us.
Oh, it's abominable. In addition to the deaths, which are, significant, the displacement, which is millions of people from their homes. But in addition, with American assistance, the Saudi-led coalition has basically created a naval blockade around all of the ports in a country that relies very heavily on imported fuel and imported medicines and to a considerable extent on imported food. And therefore, there have been electricity blackouts, and then that causes also for most municipal water systems to be shut down. There's a dire lack of medicine, including basic medicines like rehydration and other things that are for just simple childhood diseases or ordinary non-war related physical ailments. And then there's, in addition, an acute shortage of food for the vast majority of people. I mean, the very wealthy can still eat comfortably, but for most people, it's been just a complete humanitarian disaster.
Now, President Obama recently visited Saudi Arabia and had talks with the king. Do you think the topic of the humanitarian conditions on the ground in Yemen ever came up as a topic?
You know, what seems to have come up as a topic is the fact that in the past year, the Saudis have been bombing what they claim are Houthi targets, or again, targets also of the former president, who is not himself what you would call an al-Houthi, but Saleh forces as well. And yet, in all that time, they have not attacked any of al-Qaeda facilities or targets inside of Yemen, in spite of the fact that it's well known that al-Qaeda had taken over a southern port city, al-Mukalla, pretty much lock, stock, and barrel, and have presence in other places as well. After Obama left, in the past few days, finally the Saudi-led coalition, including significant ground troops from the United Arab Emirates, entered the city of al-Mukalla and forced al-Qaeda operatives to retreat from the city. So the evidence would suggest that the president spoke to Saudi officials mainly about, if we're going to provide you with additional weapons, we would like for you to use some of those against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and not only against the Houthis.
So as far as you know, as somebody who follows this issue and the conditions in Yemen, President Obama didn't directly address the humanitarian conditions on the ground.
I have never heard President Obama express any sympathy whatsoever for this humanitarian crisis. And, efforts in the UN by other parties like the Netherlands to call for an unconditional ceasefire by all parties, the United States has attempted to quash. So all the UN has done, and this has been like a year ago already, they called for Yemeni parties to stop fighting, but there has been no mention by the American government of calling on the Saudis to, exercise even reasonable restraint. I mean, Kerry has said, well, we're providing weapons in part in the hopes that they will, and also surveillance assistance and in-flight refueling. In other words, the United States is closely involved. But Secretary Kerry has referred to that as an effort to reduce civilian casualties by improving targeting. That's not the same thing as calling for or recognizing the victims of both the bombing and the naval blockade.
And I understand that there's a joint Arab military force who are demanding that the Houthis surrender. What is going to be the impact of that on the ground?
Well, I mean, that's a joint Arab, what did you call it, coalition or something like that, led by Saudi Arabia, and then a couple of other countries have joined, notably Egypt, which also just gave Saudi Arabia some islands and is very much dependent on Saudi largesse. So, I mean, it's a Saudi-led coalition, again, trying to drive out the Houthis. And at the same time, of course, I mean, the same Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is also discriminating the Houthis. You know, what the Saudis claim is that the Houthis actually are part of the Zaydi school of Islam, which is roughly under the Shafi'i denomination, if you say there are Sunnis and Shafa'is. And the point I'm trying to make is that Saudi Arabia is also discriminating against against Shia inside of Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is basically at war against Shia and those that it labels as Shia.
And I know this question is a long answer and a deep answer, but give us a brief sketch of the Saudi involvement in Yemen historically. Why are they so interested in keeping Yemen under their control?
Well, that's a good question, and you're right, it's kind of a long one, but I'll try to sort of keep it user-friendly. So Yemen is the most populous part of the Arabian Peninsula. I mean, it's actually quite green. It's always been pastoral and peasant and farming and so forth, as opposed to, say, Saudi Arabia, which is, by contrast, quite sparsely populated, and all of the monarchies of the peninsula, large portions of the population are actually expat workers. In addition, Yemen is quite poor and is a republic and has had revolutions. There was a British colony in South Yemen in the 1960s, and there was a socialist movement there. And then also in the 1960s, there was a popular, an officer's coup against the Zaydi imams, which is significant because at the time, Saudi Arabia worried about both the socialists in their rebellion against British control and the free officers who overthrew the Zaydi imam. So at that time, Saudi Arabia intervened to keep the Zaydi imam in power. Now, this is significant because now they're saying that the reason why they're intervening is to defeat the Zaydi movement, whereas in the past, they intervened to maintain a Zaydi monarchy. At the same time, of course, they long opposed the socialist government in what was then South Yemen. They opposed Yemeni unity, then, which was in 1990. In 1994, the South attempted to secede from the Union, and Saudi Arabia supported the secessionists who were socialists. So we have a history of, this is, of course, the current war is by far the most dramatic direct military intervention, but we have a long history, or at least, modern history of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia being very fearful of popular movements and republican forms of government rather than dynastic monarchies in Yemen.
Sheila, what would enable a peaceful solution in Yemen?
Well, I mean, of course, it's right now there are supposedly peace talks going on. Unfortunately, Saudi Arabia is not a direct party. So again, we're acting as if it's a civil war rather than an international intervention. And that is certainly problematic. So solving the domestic dispute would be difficult enough. It's clear that the Saudi aims, and at the very beginning you referred to the current government. You see it referred to as the internationally recognized government of President Abdurabbah Mansour Hadi, so President Hadi, who, for most of the past year has been in residence in Riyadh and is now rumored, or perhaps actually physically, in the southern port city of Aden. But, the effort to restore him to power has clearly failed and is not going to happen. So what is needed is some kind of national dialogue, preferably ending in actual competitive elections. But at the same time, what is needed is for the international community, I frequently don't like that phrase, but the United States and NATO powers to call unequivocally for a cessation of all hostilities, for humanitarian relief, and for a lifting of the blockade. So it's really a two-pronged thing. There's the domestic part, which is very sticky wicket, but there's also the international part, which anyone who's looked at it seriously realizes is responsible for most of the death and destruction, and then the deprivation, which has come from the naval blockade.
All right, Sheila, thank you so much for joining us today, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.